transcript begins at the 43rd minute of the session, because that is when I stopped writing routine observation and started writing something else. I want to be precise about what I mean. I have conducted or observed 411 extraction sessions in my career with the Drassian Oversight Directorate. I know the rhythm of a session the way a surgeon knows the sound of healthy tissue. I know when a subject is building toward resistance, when they are genuinely confused, when they are performing confusion to buy time. I have been wrong about those reads twice. I mention this not to establish my ego, but to establish my baseline, because what happened in session 119 Keth on the 14th cycle of the processing quarter is something I have no prior category for, and I am a person who requires categories. The subject was Dr. Calamarin, human, female, 41 standard years of age, civilian classification, documented specialty in comparative xenobiology, feet. She had been aboard the research vessel Sondara Reach when that vessel made unauthorized passage through the Directorate's provisional boundary, and she had been processed, along with the rest of the crew, through standard intake. The other 11 crew members were straightforward. Dr. and was placed in a separate classification track, because her secondary documentation flagged a prior association with a federated survey team that the Directorate had an open interest in, not a high priority, a loose end. Tribunal primaries Ashen, Drevith, and Wulan were assigned to her session, senior adjudicators, all three. The chamber was a standard classification 2 environment, sealed, instrumented, the tribunal behind their bench, and Dr. Marin, at the subject's position, unrestrained because she was considered low threat. I was behind the observation panel with Signals Officer Rath Velour. We were there to record. Nothing more was expected, Dr. Marin entered the chamber walking slightly slower than her intake pace. I noted that. It could mean fatigue or recalibration. She sat when directed, folded her hands on the table in front of her, and looked at each of the 3 primaries in sequence. Left to right, held on Wulan, the most senior, for approximately 2 additional seconds before she looked away. I marked the notation. Subject appears to be reading authority gradient. Standard behavior, low significance. Tribunal's primary Ashen opened. Standard preamble. Subject identification, session purpose, rights of record. Dr. Murren listened. She did not fidget. She did not look at the walls or the ceiling as subjects typically do when mapping a new space. She kept her eyes on whichever primary was speaking, and I noticed. I cannot tell exactly what triggered the notice. It was something in the quality of her stillness. She was not listening to the she was watching the faces. The first substantive question was routine. Had the Sondara Reach carried survey instruments calibrated for Directorate band frequencies? Dr. Burns said she did not know the calibration specifications of the ship's space suite. That was the navigator's domain, and she answered with a small, cooperative shrug. Standard answer. Tribunal primary Drevith made a notation, and in doing so looked briefly at Ashen before looking back at the subject. A half-second lateral glance, it means nothing. It is the gesture of a colleague who has just logged a point and is checking timing with a peer. I have made that glance 10,000 times, Dr. Murren's eyes tracked to Drevith, then to Ashen, then back to the table. She said nothing, but she had seen it. I wrote, peripheral awareness elevated. Continue observation. The session continued for 18 more minutes in unremarkable fashion, Dr. Marin answered questions about the Sondara Reach's research mandate, the survey team she had worked with 4 years prior, the nature of that work. Answers were precise where she knew the facts, and genuinely vague where she did not. I have enough experience to distinguish performed vagueness from real ignorance. Hers was real. She was not hiding information about the survey team's work. She simply had not been read into most of it. She was doing. And I did not fully understand this until I reviewed the session log afterward. Was indexing the questions against each other. When Wulan pressed her on a specific survey team report, Marin said she had not authored it. Technically true. But then she said, shh. I notice you're asking about the Reach survey separately from the survey team work. And you're keeping those tracks separate deliberately, which means you already have the survey team material. And you're trying to establish whether the Reach survey overlaps with it. She said this in the same tone she had used to answer every other question. Cooperative mild. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Primary Wulan said, "That is not a relevant observation." Dr. Marin said, "I understand." I made a longer notation. She was not guessing. The structure of the questions had told her the structure of the tribunal's existing file. Each line of inquiry began exactly where the tribunal's documentation ran out, which means each question was shaped by a gap, and the gaps formed a silhouette of what they knew. A person who was listening carefully enough could read the silhouette. She was listening that carefully. The tribunal conferred briefly off record. They returned and the session shifted to a tighter protocol. Questions no longer in building sequence but scrambled, cross-referenced, pulling from multiple tracks without apparent order. The standard technique for preventing a subject from triangulating. Wulan administered this phase personally, and I noted that she had adopted a flattened affect, the deliberate neutral expression trained interrogators use when they want to give nothing away. Doctor. Marin watched Wulanson's face for approximately 4 seconds without answering. Then she said, "There's a second human in this facility. You haven't mentioned them, but someone has already been interviewed ahead of me, and whatever they said is informing the structure of this session. To know if my account matches." Wulan said nothing. Marin said, "I think it's someone from engineering. Because the questions about the ship's instruments have a specificity that you wouldn't have unless an engineer had already explained the hardware. A xenobiologist would describe the instruments by their function. An engineer describes them by their architecture. Questions are using architectural framing." The silence in that chamber lasted 8 seconds. I counted. Tribunal Primary Dreveth looked at Oshin. Oshin looked at Wulan. Wulan did not look at either of them. This is what a controlled professional looks like when they have just had a controlled session become uncontrolled. I put down my stylus. Here is what Dr. Marin had done, as far as I was able to reconstruct it afterward. She had come into that room knowing nothing. She had no access to facility records, no knowledge of our existing documentation, no contact with the other prisoners since intake. What she had was the behavior of 3 senior adjudicators over the course of 61 minutes of structured questioning. From that, she had extracted that the tribunal already possessed survey team documentation, that the Sundara Reach survey was a secondary interest, not the primary, that another prisoner had been processed before her, and that the prior prisoner was from the engineering staff. She had not deduced these things consciously. She had read them the way you might read the edge of a shadow and tell the time of day. We do not have a category for this in our threat taxonomy. I checked. The Directorate's classification matrix has 17 columns for physical metrics, 9 for intelligence, threat metrics covering documented access and training, and 3 for psychological resilience. None of them have a row for a subject who reconstructs classified information from behavioral micropatterns in her questioners over the course of a single uncontrolled session. I filed my assessment that evening. I upgraded Dr. Marin's classification from civilian benign to restricted active. I recommended that all further sessions with any human subject require observer suppression protocols, meaning the observers behind the panel must limit their physical reactions to below detectable thresholds, and the adjudicators must be rotated after every 15 minutes to prevent pattern accumulation. The tribunal primaries reviewed my assessment. Tribunal Primary Wulan added one annotation before approving it. She wrote, "The subject was not attempting to escape. She was not attempting to deceive. She was simply present in the room, and she saw everything. I have been in this work for 19 years. I know what a dangerous species looks like. I have flagged dangerous species before. What I had not previously understood is that the dangerous ones do not need to try.